started with something so small that most people wouldn't have noticed it, or worse, would have convinced themselves it didn't matter. A paper cup of coffee, a slip of the wrist, a splash of heat. That was all it took to set everything in motion. The diner sat just off the highway, the kind of place Americans instinctively understand without needing it explained. Vinyl booths cracked with age, a counter polished thin by decades of elbows, the smell of bacon grease baked permanently into the walls. Outside, the morning was already heavy with southern heat, the kind that presses against your chest and makes even breathing feel like work. Inside, the air conditioner rattled and hummed, fighting a losing battle, but it was enough. Enough to make people linger, enough to make the place feel safe. Ethan Cross had chosen the back booth for the same reason he chose everything in his life now. Visibility. His back was to the wall, his line of sight clear to the door, the counter, the reflections in the window. It wasn't paranoia, it was muscle memory. Years of training had wired his body to map exits before menus, to register footsteps before voices. Even now, wearing plain jeans and a faded work shirt, he moved like a man still deployed. At his feet lay Shadow. The German shepherd was stretched out beneath the table, head resting lightly against Ethan's boot, eyes half closed but never fully asleep. Anyone who knew working dogs would recognize it immediately. The stillness wasn't relaxation, it was readiness. Shadow's breathing was slow, controlled. His ears twitched at every change in sound, cataloging the world the way Ethan did, only faster. For Ethan, Shadow wasn't just a dog. Shadow was a boundary between the present and the things Ethan worked every day not to drown in. The panic that crept up without warning. The nights where sleep came in fragments, broken by memories that felt sharper than anything real. Shadow grounded him, gave him weight, gave him something solid to focus on when his mind tried to pull him back to places he barely survived. The waitress, her name tag read Linda, though everyone called her Miss Linda, set a mug of coffee down in front of Ethan with a smile that had learned how to endure. "Refills on the house," she said quietly, glancing at Shadow. "Water for him too, it's going to be a hot one." Ethan nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to count as a thank you. Small kindnesses still hit him harder than gunfire ever had. They were harder to brace for. For a moment, the world narrowed to steam rising from the mug and the soft clink of silverware. For a moment, everything held. Then the door slammed open. The bell above it rang too hard, too loud, announcing not customers but dominance. 3 uniformed officers stepped inside, bringing heat, noise, and entitlement with them. Leading the group was Officer Brock Rayner, a man built like he'd spent a lifetime mistaking size for authority. His vest strained at the seams, his belt sagged with unnecessary gear, and his eyes scanned the room the way a predator looks for weakness, not threats. "Smells like grease and bad decisions in here," Rayner said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. His partners laughed on cue. Conversation died instantly. Heads lowered, forks paused mid-air. The diner didn't go silent because people respected the badge. It went silent because they'd learned what happened if you didn't. Rayner's eyes landed on Ethan's booth. More specifically, they landed on the black and tan shape beneath the table. A grin spread across his face, slow and ugly. He said nothing, just adjusted the loose lid on the large coffee cup in his hand and started down the aisle. Ethan saw it all before it happened. The shift in Rayner's shoulders, the angle of his wrist, the calculated stumble timed perfectly to the narrow space beside the booth. Hot coffee sloshed out of the cup, splashing across the floor, the steam rising instantly. A line of it splattered close enough that Shadow jerked his paws back with a sharp intake of breath. Not a yelp, not a bark, just pain swallowed whole. Rayner stopped and looked down, fake surprise painted across his face. "Oops," he said, chuckling. "Didn't see the dog." The word dog came out like an insult. Ethan's hand slid to Shadow's neck, steady and firm. He felt the tension there, coiled and electric. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply looked up. Rayner leaned closer, invading the space on purpose. "You shouldn't have dangerous animals in public places," he sneered. "Someone could get hurt." The irony hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "He's under the table," Ethan said calmly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. "He's not in your way." Rayner's smile faltered, just for a second. Men like him thrived on fear. Calm unsettled them. "You watch your tone," Rayner snapped. "I am the law in this town." Ethan said nothing. Silence, when used correctly, is louder than shouting. Rayner waited for anger, for defiance, for anything he could turn into justification. When it didn't come, he scoffed and turned away. "Clean it up," he muttered, already bored. The officers took a booth near the center of the diner, laughing, ordering without menus, without hesitation. No one brought them a check. Ethan knelt to blot the coffee from the floor, his movements controlled, his mind racing. This wasn't an accident, it was a test. And tests like that only came from men who had never been held accountable. As he returned to his seat, an older man at the next booth leaned slightly closer. His hands trembled as he stirred his tea, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "That one," the man whispered, nodding toward Rayner. "He's been doing this for years." Ethan didn't ask how. He already knew. What mattered wasn't the coffee. It wasn't even the dog. It was the certainty on Rayner's face. The certainty that nothing would happen, that no one would stop him, that the badge made him untouchable. That certainty was familiar to Ethan. He'd seen it before, in different uniforms, under different flags. Power without oversight always looked the same. Ethan finished his coffee slowly. He didn't leave. He didn't confront anyone. He paid his bill, nodded once to Miss Linda, and walked out into the heat with Shadow at his side. Most people would have driven on. Most people would have decided it wasn't their fight. Ethan Cross didn't have that luxury anymore. Not after everything he'd already lost. Not after learning the hard way what happens when good people convince themselves that silence is safety. As he climbed into his truck and pulled onto the side road instead of the highway, the decision wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fueled by anger. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. A cup of coffee had just become evidence, and Ethan wasn't the kind of man who ignored evidence. By late afternoon, Ethan Cross had learned what the locals never said out loud. You didn't have to ask questions in a town like this. You just had to watch where people looked and where they refused to. The town called itself Harbor Point on the map, but it wasn't a harbor in any meaningful sense anymore. The docks were half-rusted, the shrimp boats fewer every year, replaced by bait shops selling more souvenirs than supplies. One main road cut through the center like a spine, flanked by a courthouse, a police station, 3 churches, and a strip of small businesses that survived on habit more than profit. It was the kind of place where everyone waved, where names traveled faster than cars, and where silence was a form of currency. Ethan parked his truck and walked. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way you walk when you don't want to look like you're looking. Shadow stayed close, vest on, head level, tail neutral. Together they moved through the town as if they belonged there, which, in places like this, mattered more than any ID. The first thing Ethan noticed was what wasn't happening. No squad cars rolling steadily through neighborhoods. No officers stopping to chat with shop owners in ways that felt protective. Instead, police vehicles were parked, always parked, behind businesses, beside alleyways, idling in the shade like animals conserving energy. When they moved with purpose, not patrol. That told him more than any statistic could. At a hardware store near the edge of town, a man named Carl rang up Ethan's purchase. Just a pair of work gloves and a flashlight, then hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window. "You passing through?" Carl asked, voice careful. "For now," Ethan replied. Carl nodded once. "That's usually best." The phrase hung there, unfinished. Ethan didn't push. Pressure broke things. Time revealed them. 2 blocks over, at a family-owned auto shop, Ethan watched an officer, one of Rayner's men, lean against a tow truck, laughing with the driver. No ticket book, no clipboard, just conversation and a handshake that lingered too long. When the officer left, the driver peeled off in the opposite direction without paying a fee or logging a stop. The mechanics of it were always the same. Power doesn't need to shout when it can whisper favors. This wasn't chaos, it was a system, and systems leave patterns. At the diner, Miss Linda moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned not to draw attention. Her smile was still warm, but it came with conditions now: angles, glances, pauses. When Rayner's cruiser rolled by outside, her shoulders tightened, just a fraction. She didn't stop working, she just worked smaller. "You get used to it," she said later, wiping down the counter that didn't need wiping. "You learn when to talk and when to keep your head down." Ethan watched a couple at the far booth quietly slide cash under their plates before leaving. No receipt, no nod, just compliance. In towns like Harbor Point, corruption didn't wear masks. It wore routines. Everyone knew the price of peace, even if no one called it that. Free meals, cash fines, business owners sponsoring events they didn't believe in, traffic stops that ended differently depending on where your plates were from and how much money you carried. An older man sat near the window, coffee untouched, eyes fixed on the street. His name was Walter Hayes, a veteran, according to the cap resting beside his mug. Army, long time ago. "They don't bother me much anymore," Walter said quietly, without turning. "Old men aren't worth the trouble, but I've seen what they do to folks who can't fight back." Ethan didn't interrupt. "Used to be a kid down the road," Walter continued. "Got pulled over for a broken taillight. Ended up charged with resisting. Spent a night in jail. Lost his job. All because he asked for a receipt." Walter finally looked at Ethan then. "That's how it works. You push back, they push harder, and they've got more time than you." The courthouse loomed over the town square like a relic from a better promise. Flags out front, stone steps worn smooth by generations of hope and disappointment. Inside, Ethan watched a clerk process paperwork with robotic calm. Files stacked neatly. Everything looked legitimate. That was the trick. The machine didn't look broken. It looked well-maintained. Ethan sat on a bench and listened. Names came up in low voices. Permits delayed. Inspections scheduled suddenly. Fines adjusted quietly. It was never overt enough to make headlines, just enough to make resistance expensive. A local shop owner, Dolores Finch, closed her boutique early that day. She flipped the sign to closed, even though it was only 4 o'clock. Ethan saw her lock the door twice, hands shaking. "They say it's about safety," she told him later, when Shadow's presence made her brave enough to talk. "Fire code, sanitation, zoning. They can find a reason if they want one." "What happens if you don't pay?" Ethan asked. Dolores laughed, a thin sound. "You ever try running a business while being inspected every week? While customers see squad cars parked outside like a warning sign?" Fear, Ethan realized, was being laundered through bureaucracy. That was the machine. Not brute force, though that was always waiting, but paperwork, procedure, plausible deniability. By nightfall, Ethan had mapped most of it. The tow driver who moved stolen cars, the officer who handled tourists, the patrol route that skipped certain streets and hovered over others. It wasn't random, it was efficient. And efficiency required leadership. Brock Rayner didn't have to be everywhere. He just had to be predictable. His men did the rest. They learned what was rewarded and what was ignored. They learned who mattered. That's how cultures form, not by orders, but by example. Ethan thought about the term people use so casually, bad apple. It was comforting. It implied containment. One man, one problem. Remove him and the barrel stays clean. But barrels don't rot from one apple. They rot when conditions let decay spread. That was the lesson Harbor Point had learned the hard way. And the lesson Ethan had learned overseas, watching good intentions drown in silence. As the sun dipped low, Ethan returned to his truck, Shadow hopping in with practiced ease. He didn't start the engine right away. He sat, hands on the wheel, watching the courthouse lights flicker on one by one. This wasn't about revenge. It never was. Revenge burned hot and fast and left nothing useful behind. This was about leverage, about proof, about turning whispers into records and routines into charges. Ethan pulled a small notebook from the console and began to write. Times, locations, names, patterns. The basics never changed. Investigations lived and died on details most people ignored. Somewhere in town, a cruiser rolled past, slow and confident. The machine was running smoothly tonight. It had no idea it had been noticed. Ethan closed the notebook and finally started the engine. He wasn't ready to act. Not yet. First came understanding. First came patience. And then, when the time was right, pressure. As the truck rolled toward the outskirts of Harbor Point, toward the quiet tree line and the places where lights didn't reach, Ethan knew the next phase wouldn't be about the town anymore. It would be about him, about what he was still carrying, about whether he could do this without becoming the thing he was trying to expose. Shadow lifted his head, sensing the shift. Ethan reached over and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, grounding himself once more. The machine was real. The damage was real. And so was the cost of standing up to it. The question now wasn't whether Harbor Point was broken. It was whether Ethan Cross was ready to let it break him first, or whether he would break the silence instead. By the time Ethan Cross reached the tree line outside Harbor Point, night had settled in with a kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. The town lights faded behind him, replaced by the steady rhythm of insects and the low hum of wind moving through pine needles. He parked the truck in a small clearing used mostly by hunters during the fall, killed the engine, and sat in the dark longer than necessary, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. Out here, no one watched him. No one expected anything from him, and that was both a relief and a problem. Inside the truck, Shadow shifted, turning once before settling with a soft huff. Ethan reached out without looking, his hand finding the familiar weight of the dog's shoulder. The contact steadied his breathing, slowed the tight spiral in his chest. He'd learned that trick the hard way. When the pressure built, you anchor to something real, something alive. Ethan hadn't always needed that. There was a time when his life made sense in clean lines and clear objectives. Mission briefings, checklists, rules of engagement. Back then, pain was physical, immediate, solvable. You trained harder, moved faster, trusted the man beside you. If something broke, you fixed it or you learned to work around it. Simple. Home was never part of the equation. Now, home was where he lost ground. The small rental house he stayed in when he wasn't on reserve duty felt temporary in every way. Boxes never fully unpacked. Furniture chosen for function, not comfort. A calendar on the wall marked with reminders he didn't always keep. Therapy appointments, refill dates for prescriptions he hated needing. A few days circled in red, the days he was supposed to call his daughter. He stared at those circles more than he liked to admit. Ethan's marriage hadn't collapsed in one dramatic moment. It eroded quietly, the way trust does when absence becomes routine. Missed birthdays, short tempers, the look in his wife's eyes when she realized she'd learned to manage life without him. By the time the paperwork was signed, the decision felt less like a betrayal and more like an admission. He wasn't good at being home. He never had been. Shadow was the exception. The dog had come into Ethan's life after a night that still replayed in fragments, sirens in his head, the metallic taste of blood, the sound of a friend shouting his name from somewhere he couldn't reach. The official reports called it an operational failure. The unofficial truth was messier. A call made too late. A warning ignored. The kind of mistake that didn't kill you outright but followed you home. Shadow had been assigned as a temporary support animal at first, a tool on paper. But tools don't wake you from nightmares by pressing their weight into your chest. Tools don't sense panic before it blooms and intervene without being asked. Shadow stayed. Ethan let him. That decision probably saved his life. It didn't fix him. It didn't erase the damage. But it gave him a fighting chance to function, to show up, to keep his hands steady when the world felt like it was tilting. The doctors called it PTSD. The military paperwork listed it under codes and limitations. Ethan thought of it as leakage, the war bleeding into places it didn't belong. Grocery store aisles that felt too narrow, loud laughter that triggered muscle memory, the constant, exhausting vigilance that never shut off. He managed it the only way he knew how: structure and restraint. No alcohol, ever. Sleep routines, even when sleep didn't come. Physical training every morning, because exhaustion quieted the noise. Shadow trained twice a day, not because the dog needed it, but because the discipline grounded them both. Ethan had rules now, personal ones. He didn't carry a weapon unless absolutely necessary. He didn't escalate situations with civilians present. He didn't strike first unless there was no other option. These weren't regulations. They were promises to himself, to the people who still trusted him to be better than his worst day. Harbor Point tested every one of those rules. As Ethan set up his temporary camp that night, the physical work helped him think. Tent secured, gear organized, supplies checked, familiar motions, familiar order. Shadow watched from a few feet away, ears alert, posture relaxed but ready. Ethan replayed the diner scene in his mind, not the insult, but the calculation. Raynor had wanted a reaction, wanted Ethan to snap. That wasn't accidental. It was strategy. Provoke, escalate, justify. Men like Raynor thrived on the moment someone lost control. Ethan had almost lost it anyway. Not because of pride, because of shadow. Because pain inflicted for sport stripped away layers of restraint faster than any insult ever could. That was the danger. That was the line he couldn't afford to cross. The lesson wasn't new, but it was sharper here. Strength without discipline is a liability. Anger is easy. Control is costly. He thought about his daughter then, the way she'd looked at him the last time he dropped her off, older, somehow, more cautious. She didn't ask him to stay anymore. She just asked when he'd be back. Children learn patterns faster than adults like to admit. Ethan wanted to be someone she could rely on, someone who didn't disappear when things got complicated. That was the real risk in Harbor Point, not the badge, not the gun. It was the temptation to solve the problem the way he'd been trained to overseas. Fast, final, irreversible. That path always ended the same way, with collateral damage, with headlines that buried context, with people who needed protection paying the price. Ethan sat on a folding chair and pulled a small notebook from his pack, flipping past pages already filled with notes. He paused, pen hovering, then wrote a single line at the top of a new page. Win it in daylight. It was a reminder, not just about timing, but about transparency, about letting the truth do the heavy lifting instead of fists or firepower. Evidence didn't care how angry you were. Courts didn't care how justified it felt. What mattered was what could be proven. Shadow stood and moved closer, resting his chin on Ethan's knee. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "You keep me honest," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Out here, away from the town, Ethan could admit what he never said out loud. He was tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixed, but the kind that settled into your bones. Tired of fighting systems that protected themselves. Tired of explaining trauma to people who only understood it in theory. Tired of carrying guilt that no amount of service seemed to offset. But he wasn't empty, not yet. That mattered, because what Harbor Point needed wasn't another explosion. It needed pressure applied slowly, relentlessly, until cracks formed. That kind of work demanded patience, planning, and a man who could sit with discomfort without needing immediate release. Ethan had learned that skill at great personal cost. As he lay down that night, listening to Shadow's steady breathing nearby, Ethan knew the next steps would pull him deeper into the town's machinery. Watching, recording, waiting. It would test his restraint in ways combat never had. At war, enemies were obvious. Here, they smiled and shook hands and hid behind procedures. The way his therapist had taught him. The thoughts drifted. The images softened. Tomorrow, he would begin moving again, not as a warrior, but as a witness. And witnesses, when they stayed standing long enough, had a way of changing outcomes. The second time Ethan Cross walked into the diner, it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't nostalgia. It was timing. Sunday mornings in Harbor Point followed a predictable rhythm, as reliable as tides. Church let out at 10 sharp, and within minutes the diner filled with families in press clothes, older couples moving slowly but deliberately, kids sliding into booze while parents scanned the room for familiar faces. It was the one window each week when the whole town occupied the same space, when conversations overlapped and attention was shared. If you wanted witnesses, this was when you showed up. Ethan arrived early enough to choose his seat, but late enough to be noticed. He didn't take the corner this time. He walked straight through the center of the room, boots steady against the worn floor, Shadow at his side wearing a clearly marked service vest. Heads turned. Voices dipped. People recognized him now, the quiet man with the dog, the one Brock Rayner had singled out days earlier. Ethan chose the large round booth by the window, the one no one used. It wasn't official, but everyone knew. That booth belonged to Rayner. It was where he sat every Sunday, holding court, letting the town orbit him for an hour. It was a small thing, meaningless on paper, but power lived in symbols. Take the symbols, and the structure wobbled. Miss Linda saw him sit and froze mid-step. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to Ethan. She approached slowly, lowering her voice when she reached the table. "Hun," she said gently, "you might want to move. That table—" "I know," Ethan said, meeting her eyes. "I'll be quick." She hesitated, hands twisting in her apron, then nodded once. She didn't argue. That alone told Ethan how deep the fear ran. As the diner filled, the tension thickened. Conversations stayed low. People pretended not to watch the door. A few exchanged looks that carried something new beneath the anxiety, anticipation maybe, or hope they were afraid to name. Shadow settled beneath the table, positioned facing the entrance, body relaxed but alert. Ethan placed a hand briefly on the dog's back, grounding himself. He ordered simply, coffee, eggs, nothing that would keep him there longer than necessary. At 10 on the dot, the door swung open. Brock Rayner entered with his usual entourage, laughter already loud, confidence unchecked. He scanned the room the way he always did, expecting the world to arrange itself around him. Then he saw the booth. The laughter cut off mid-breath. His face darkened, flushing from pink to red. The pause stretched just long enough for the entire diner to register the shift. This wasn't irritation. This was a challenge. Rayner crossed the room in long strides, one hand resting casually on his baton, the other adjusting his belt. He stopped at the table, looming over Ethan, blocking the sunlight streaming through the window. "You're in my seat," Rayner said. Ethan didn't look up right away. He finished cutting his eggs, set his fork down carefully, and only then raised his eyes. "I don't see a reservation sign," he said evenly. His voice carried just far enough. "If it's first come, I think I'm fine." The room went silent. Rayner leaned closer. "You think this is funny?" "No," Ethan replied. "I think it's public seating." That was the first lesson, delivered without explanation. Authority that depends on intimidation collapses when it's treated like something ordinary. Rayner smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped back slightly and gave a subtle nod. That was all it took. One of his deputies, thin, restless, eager to prove something, moved first. He didn't address Ethan. He didn't even look at him. His attention went straight under the table. The kick came fast and low. It connected with Shadow's ribs, the impact audible. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the diner. Shadow growled, deep and controlled, muscles coiling instinctively, teeth flashing for just a second. Several people gasped. A chair scraped. Someone whispered a curse. Ethan's heart slammed hard against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system. Every instinct screamed to act, to protect, to end the threat immediately. His hand clenched reflexively, the old pathways lighting up. This was the line. "Down," Ethan said sharply. "Stay." Shadow froze. The growl faded, replaced by a rigid stillness that spoke of absolute trust. The dog's eyes never left the deputy, but he didn't move. That was the second lesson. Discipline is not the absence of power, it's control over it. The deputy hesitated, surprised. That hesitation cost him. From the booth behind them, an elderly man stood abruptly. Walter Hayes. His hands shook, but his voice carried. "You don't kick a dog," Walter said. "What kind of man does that?" The room held its breath. The larger deputy didn't even turn. He shoved Walter back with one arm, sending him crashing into the booth. Silverware clattered to the floor. Miss Linda cried out. That was the spark. Rayner's smile vanished. He drew his taser, raising it toward Ethan's chest. "You're under arrest," he barked, "for disorderly conduct." He fired. Ethan moved. The probes missed, embedding harmlessly in the vinyl seat behind him. In one fluid motion, Ethan closed the distance, redirecting Rayner's arm, using leverage instead of strength. It was efficient, controlled, over in seconds. Rayner hit the floor hard, pinned, wrist locked at an angle that made further resistance impossible. Gasps filled the room. Chairs scraped back. Someone yelled to call the police, not realizing how absurd that sounded. Then the guns came out. 2 black pistols leveled at Ethan's head. The room froze completely. Ethan made the calculation instantly. He could disarm one, maybe both, but not without risk. Not with civilians this close. Not with Shadow exposed. Not with Walter still down. This was where restraint mattered most. Ethan released the hold slowly, stood, and raised his hands. "I'm complying," he said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I am unarmed. I am surrendering." Rayner scrambled to his feet, humiliated, furious. "Cuff him!" he shouted. As they dragged Ethan away, Shadow strained against his leash, eyes wild, confusion cutting through his training. Animal control was already moving in, summoned without hesitation. The third lesson burned itself into the room. Escalation favors those willing to break rules. Survival favors those who know when not to. As Ethan was pushed through the door, he caught a glimpse of the crowd. Faces pale, eyes wide. But something had shifted. The silence wasn't passive anymore. It was charged. People had seen it, all of it. They'd seen the kick, the shove, the taser, the guns. They'd seen who crossed the line first. That mattered more than Ethan's pride, more than his bruises, more than the humiliation of being led away in cuffs. This wasn't a personal loss. It was groundwork. The diner doors closed behind him, cutting off the noise. The sun outside was blinding, the air thick and unmoving. Ethan was shoved into the back of a cruiser, metal biting into his wrists. He leaned back against the hard plastic seat, breathing steadily, counting seconds, listening to the engine idle. The line he wouldn't cross was clear now. Violence would only validate the machine. Evidence would dismantle it. As the cruiser pulled away, Ethan knew the next phase had begun. What happened in that diner wasn't the fight, it was the invitation. And soon the machine that thrived in shadow would be forced into the light. The work Ethan Cross did next didn't look like justice. It looked like waiting. After the diner, after the cuffs in the ride, In the quiet release that came without apology, Ethan disappeared from the parts of Harbor Point where people expected him to be seen. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't file complaints. He didn't make calls that could be traced or statements that could be twisted. He returned to the edges, the tree line, the service roads, the forgotten places where the town's routines were laid bare. This was ghost work, the kind no one noticed until it was too late. Ethan set his base just outside town, far enough to stay invisible, close enough to respond. His truck became an office, a shelter, and a listening post. Inside it, everything had a place. Maps marked with pencil, not ink. A burner phone that stayed powered off unless needed. A tablet secured behind layered encryption. And Shadow's harness, lightweight, unobtrusive, carrying more than it appeared. Shadow adjusted quickly. Working dogs understood purpose. The vest meant focus. The hand signals meant silence. The bond between them had always been built on trust, and now it became operational. Ethan never asked Shadow to go where he wouldn't go himself. He never put the dog in unnecessary danger. The work wasn't about speed, it was about certainty. Ethan began with patterns. Every town ran on rhythms, and Harbor Point was no different. Brock Rayner's unit didn't patrol randomly. They rotated pressure. Certain streets were quiet for weeks, then hit hard in clusters. Traffic stops spiked on weekends when tourists passed through. Late nights saw cruisers parked behind bars and storage facilities rather than on residential streets. It wasn't law enforcement, it was resource management. Ethan logged everything: times, locations, badge numbers, vehicle IDs, how long engines idled, how often lights flashed, who got pulled over and who didn't. The data told a story before any audio ever would. The first solid receipt came 3 nights in. Shadow moved low through tall grass behind a shuttered bait shop. Chest camera angled just enough to capture the adjacent lot. The rain that night was steady, blurring reflections, masking sound. On the screen inside the truck, Ethan watched Brock Rayner's cruiser idle beside a rented sedan with out-of-state plates. The driver stood outside, hands visible, body stiff with uncertainty. Middle-aged, wedding ring, vacation clothes ruined by weather. "You know why I stopped you," Rayner said, voice distorted but clear enough. The man shook his head. I wasn't speeding." "Speed limit drops coming into town," Rayner replied casually. "Happens fast, real easy to miss." The implication was clear. Contest it, and the problem grew. Rayner leaned back, relaxed. "We can sort it out right here," he added. 500 cash, or we go down to the station and see how long it takes." The man hesitated, looked back at the car, probably at his family waiting inside. Then he reached for his wallet with shaking hands. Shadow's camera caught everything: the exchange, the smirk, the wave that dismissed the man like an inconvenience. Ethan saved the file, duplicated it, encrypted it, and tagged it with time, location, and identifiers. 1 receipt. The second came from the industrial side of town. A tow truck rolled in just after midnight, its paint flaking, its driver moving with nervous efficiency. The man was known locally as a fixer, someone who made things disappear quickly. Stolen cars, unwanted evidence, broken chains of custody. Rayner didn't hide this meeting. He didn't need to. Shadow stayed hidden near a stack of old pallets as the tow truck driver handed over a thick envelope. They spoke openly about inventory, about parts stripped and moved, about percentages. It wasn't a shakedown, it was a partnership. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest as he watched. Not anger, disgust. This wasn't desperation, this was entitlement. He logged it anyway. Second receipt. The third case took longer, and it was the one that mattered most. Civil asset forfeiture didn't leave dramatic footage. It left paperwork. Confiscated cash. Vehicles seized under vague suspicion and never returned. Ethan spent days tracking reports that never made headlines. He cross-referenced names, followed court dates that were quietly postponed. He watched families come and go from the courthouse looking smaller each time. Shadow captured one interaction behind a convenience store where an officer inventoried cash found during a stop. No charges filed, no receipt given. The money disappeared into a locked pouch that never showed up in evidence logs. Ethan added it to the archive. 3 receipts turned into 10. 10 into dozens. Each one alone could be dismissed, contextualized, explained away. Together they formed a pattern that no amount of spin could hide. This was the lesson Ethan had learned the hardest way. Truth doesn't need drama, it needs volume. The work took a toll. Sleep came in fragments. Ethan woke often, heart racing, fingers flexing as if searching for something he'd lost. Shadow responded every time, pressing close, reminding him where he was. The nights were long, and the silence carried weight. There were moments Ethan wondered if he was slipping back into the same tunnel vision that had nearly destroyed him before. So he slowed down. He took notes by hand instead of staring at screens too long. He ate regularly, even when he didn't feel hungry. He ran in the mornings until his lungs burned, grounding himself in exhaustion that felt earned. Discipline wasn't just a strategy for the mission, it was survival. There were temptations, moments where Ethan could have pushed harder, moved faster, confronted someone directly. He resisted them all. Because ghost work wasn't about confrontation, it was about inevitability. Every file was backed up automatically when Shadow returned within range. Every upload was time-stamped, geotagged, and mirrored to multiple locations. A simple check-in code confirmed Ethan's safety. Miss it, and the system escalated. Alerts went out. Coordinates followed. Ethan didn't need to threaten anyone with that. The power of the system came from the fact that it didn't care who Brock Rayner was. It didn't negotiate. It didn't fear reputations or family names. It just recorded. As the days passed, Ethan noticed something else. People were watching him too. A man at the gas station lingered a little longer. A woman at the grocery store slipped him a folded receipt with a time and a license plate written on the back. Someone had started paying attention. Someone had decided the risk might be worth it. That was the quiet shift, the one no one announced. Ethan never asked anyone to help. He didn't want heroes. He wanted witnesses. People who understood that change didn't come from charging headfirst into power, but from refusing to let lies sit unchallenged. One night, sitting in the truck with rain tapping against the roof, Ethan replayed the diner footage again. Not for evidence, for memory. He watched the moment where Shadow flinched, where Walter fell, where guns were drawn. He paused the frame and stared at it longer than necessary. This was the line he'd chosen not to cross, and it had cost him, physically, emotionally, socially. But it had bought him something far more valuable than immediate satisfaction. It had bought him credibility. By the end of the second week, the archive was complete, not exhaustive but sufficient, enough to establish intent, pattern, and scope, enough to draw attention from people who didn't answer to Harbor Point. Ethan closed the tablet and powered it down, his reflection faint in the dark screen. He felt no triumph, no relief, just readiness. The ghost work was done. What came next wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be hidden. It would be public, unavoidable, and dangerous in ways this phase hadn't been. The machine didn't respond to whispers once it realized it was being watched. It lashed out. Ethan rested a hand on Shadow's harness, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. "No guns," he said softly, "just receipts." Shadow didn't respond. He didn't need to. The evidence campaign had transformed suspicion into certainty, and certainty, once exposed, had a way of demanding answers. The next move wouldn't be about watching anymore. It would be about stepping into the open and letting the truth speak for itself. Sunday morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of deceptive calm that made everything feel possible. Harbor Point woke early. Church bells echoed across the streets. Doors opened. Families spilled out dressed in their best versions of themselves. It was the one day the town pretended it wasn't afraid. Ethan Cross chose that day on purpose. He didn't wear tactical clothing. He didn't hide. He dressed like a man who belonged there. Clean shirt, worn boots, nothing that invited suspicion or admiration. Shadow walked at his heel, vest visible, posture composed. The message wasn't subtle, but it wasn't aggressive either. Normal, public, documented. When Ethan pushed open the diner door, the familiar bell rang out, sharp and clear. Conversation dipped, then resumed in careful layers. People noticed him immediately. Some recognized him from the earlier incident. Others recognized Shadow. A few recognized the tension before they understood why. Ethan didn't pause. He didn't scan for approval or retreat to the edges. He walked straight to the large round booth by the window, the Sunday table, and sat down. Forks froze. Someone inhaled sharply. Miss Linda looked up from behind the counter, eyes widening. She started toward him, then stopped, calculating. The diner didn't have posted rules about seating. Everyone knew that table was Brock Rayner's because Brock Rayner had made it so. Ethan placed Shadow under the table facing the door, then rested his hands flat on the tabletop. He ordered coffee. Nothing else. The diner filled quickly, plates clattered, coffee poured. The noise never reached full volume. It hovered, restrained, like a held breath. Miss Linda set a small plate of biscuits on Ethan's table that he hadn't ordered. She didn't say a word. The gesture was quiet, but it mattered. At 10 sharp, the door swung open. Brock Rayner entered laughing, his voice leading him into the room like a claim. His deputies followed close behind, already loosening their belts in anticipation of a long, indulgent meal. Rayner waved at a few people without slowing, his eyes scanning automatically for his seat. He saw Ethan. The laughter died instantly. Rayner stopped so abruptly one of his deputies nearly collided with him. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was electric. Every eye in the diner shifted toward the booth by the window. Rayner's face flushed dark red. He crossed the room in long strides, boots heavy against the floor. He didn't speak until he was standing over Ethan, blocking the light. "You've got a lot of nerve," Rayner said. "That's my table." Ethan didn't look up immediately. He stirred his coffee once, deliberately, then raised his eyes. "It was empty," he said evenly. "I sat down." Rayner leaned closer, voice dropping. "Get up." Ethan shook his head once. "I'm having coffee." Rayner glanced around the room, aware now of the attention. He smiled tightly and tapped his baton against the table. 3 sharp clicks meant to intimidate. "You're asking for trouble," he said. Ethan met his gaze calmly. "I'm asking for breakfast." The deputy on Rayner's left moved without waiting for instruction. He stepped closer and kicked under the table, hard. Shadow took the blow to the ribs with a sharp grunt, body tensing instantly. A low growl vibrated through the floorboards, primal and unmistakable. Several people gasped. A chair scraped back. "Shadow," Ethan said firmly. "Down. Stay." The dog froze mid-motion, muscles rigid, eyes locked on the deputy's legs. The growl faded, replaced by absolute stillness. The deputy hesitated, startled. That hesitation was enough to shift the room. From a nearby booth, a man stood up abruptly. Not Walter this time, but a younger father, baseball cap pulled low, his kid pressed close behind him. "You can't do that," the man said, voice shaking. "You can't just hurt someone's dog." Rayner turned, anger flaring. "Sit down," he snapped. The man didn't. That was new. Rayner's other deputies shoved him hard, sending him stumbling back into the booth. Silverware crashed to the floor. A woman screamed. Everything happened at once after that. Rayner drew his taser, shouting orders that overlapped and contradicted each other. The sound of the safety clicking off was loud in the sudden quiet. Ethan stood slowly, hands visible, positioning himself between Rayner and the civilians without appearing to advance. "Everyone, calm down," Ethan said, voice carrying. "No one needs to get hurt." Rayner fired anyway. Ethan twisted just enough for the probes to miss, embedding in the booth behind him. In the same motion, he stepped forward, redirected Rayner's arm, and used leverage to take him down. It was controlled, surgical, over in seconds. Rayner hit the floor hard, gasping, wrist locked at an angle that forced compliance without breaking bone. The diner erupted, voices shouting, chairs scraping, someone yelling to call 911. Then the guns came out. Both deputies drew their pistols, aiming at Ethan's head. The room froze again, this time with real fear. Shadow strained against the leash, confusion and anger flashing in his eyes. Ethan made the calculation instantly. He could disarm one, maybe both, but not without risk, not with civilians this close, not with children in the line of fire. This was the line he had already decided not to cross. Ethan released Rayner's wrist slowly and stepped back, raising his hands. "I am complying," he said clearly, loudly enough for every phone and every witness. "I am unarmed. I am surrendering." Rayner scrambled to his feet, humiliated and furious. "Cuff him," he shouted. "Now!" As the cuffs snapped closed around Ethan's wrists, a woman near the counter raised her phone, recording openly. Another man followed suit. No one told them to stop. Animal control arrived almost immediately, taking Shadow despite Miss Linda's protests. The dog resisted briefly, eyes never leaving Ethan, then complied at a quiet command. That moment hurt more than the cuffs ever could. Ethan was marched out through the front door this time, not the back. The sunlight was blinding. The crowd spilled onto the sidewalk behind them, drawn by instinct and disbelief. As Ethan was pushed into the cruiser, he caught fragments of conversation. "They kicked the dog. He didn't even fight back. They pulled guns." Those words mattered. They would travel. Inside the car, Ethan leaned back against the hard plastic seat, breathing steadily, counting turns, noting landmarks. His wrists ached. His ribs would bruise. His pride was intact, and that was the least important thing. What mattered was that the trap had closed. Rayner had escalated in public. His deputies had assaulted civilians. Weapons had been drawn without justification. Phones had been raised. Statements would follow. This wasn't a confrontation for victory. It was a confrontation for record. As the cruiser pulled away, Ethan didn't look back at the diner. He didn't need to. The truth was already moving, carried by people who had decided they were done pretending. The machine had snapped. And once a trap closes in daylight, there's no easy way to open it again. Justice didn't arrive in Harbor Point with sirens and speeches. It arrived quietly, the way real consequences usually do, through paperwork, sealed envelopes, and people who didn't ask permission before asking questions. Ethan Cross spent the night in a holding room that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. No interrogation, no explanations, just time. He sat upright on the bench, wrists uncuffed but marked, listening to the distant bark he recognized instantly. Shadow. Somewhere on the other side of concrete and chain link, his partner was still calling out, steady and insistent. Not fear, location. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed. The temptation to replay the diner scene rose again. The kick, the shove, the guns, but he let it pass. Rumination never fixed anything. He'd learned that in therapy, the kind he once resisted and now depended on. Feel it, name it, release it. Morning came with a shift in tone. It started with voices in the hallway, measured, unfamiliar, not local. Then doors opening that usually stayed shut, the cadence of command without the bluster. When the lock finally turned, the man who stepped inside wasn't wearing Harbor Point blue. He introduced himself simply. Internal Affairs, State Patrol Task Force. There would be counsel, he said. There would be statements. Ethan would be released pending review. Not an apology, not yet, but the process had begun. That was the first lesson of the fallout. Justice doesn't sprint, it walks. Over the next 48 hours, the town learned the difference. Rayner and his deputies were placed on administrative leave before noon. By evening, warrants followed, first for devices, then for vehicles, then for accounts. The courthouse saw a line it hadn't seen in years, people filing affidavits. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Receipts surfaced, not just Ethan's. A shop owner brought in logs of donations he'd been told were voluntary. A retired teacher produced a list of traffic stops she'd recorded out of habit. A tow operator, suddenly nervous, requested immunity in exchange for testimony. Someone leaked body cam metadata that didn't match incident reports. Patterns stacked. Context formed. This was the part no one liked to watch. No catharsis. No single villain collapsing on camera. Just accumulation. Weight. Pressure applied until systems either adapted or cracked. The police chief resigned quietly on day 3. On day 4, the county prosecutor recused herself. By the end of the week, a federal inquiry was announced, not because of Ethan alone, but because Ethan had forced the truth into daylight where it could be shared. That was always the point. Shadow came back to him late the second night, escorted by a woman from Animal Services who wouldn't meet Ethan's eyes. The dog leapt into the truck, whining once before settling, pressing his full weight against Ethan's leg as if to confirm reality. Ethan rested his forehead against Shadow's neck and let the moment take him. Relief didn't erase what had happened. It just made room for the next thing. The next thing was consequence. Harbor Point didn't heal overnight. There were backlash whispers, anonymous notes slipped under doors, stares that lingered too long. Fear doesn't vanish when the threat leaves. It has to be taught something else. Safety, consistency, time. Ethan stayed longer than he'd planned, not to lead but to listen. He sat with Miss Linda after closing, helping stack chairs while she talked about her husband, gone 10 years now, and how the diner had been her last anchor. He shared coffee with Walter, who admitted he'd started sleeping better once he decided to write his statement, even if it scared him. Courage, Ethan learned again, wasn't loud. It was cumulative. There were costs, too. A man who'd spoken up found his tires slashed. A woman who'd testified received a letter implying her inspections would be thorough. The task force responded faster this time. The message was clear. Intimidation would not be tolerated. Still, the damage lingered. Trust, once broken, didn't rebuild on command. Ethan understood that better than most. At night, the old dreams returned, softer but persistent. In them, he was always almost too late. He woke sweating, breath shallow, shadow already there, grounding him back to the present. He logged the nights honestly in his notebook. Progress wasn't linear. Healing never was. One afternoon, Ethan sat in his truck outside the school where his daughter attended, engine off, window down. He hadn't told her he was in town. He watched parents gather, laughter floating across the lot. When she finally emerged, backpack slung low, she scanned the crowd out of habit. She saw him and froze. He stepped out slowly, hands visible, the way he always did now, as if approaching a skittish animal. Her smile came cautious, then real. They hugged, brief but sincere. They didn't talk about Harbor Point. They talked about math class, about a science project, about the dog she remembered sleeping at the foot of her bed years ago. He listened more than he spoke, another rule he'd learned the hard way. That evening, Ethan finally left town. He didn't do it with ceremony, no convoy, no applause, just a turn onto the highway as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in quiet colors. Shadow watched the road ahead, ears relaxed, the tension that had lived in his frame easing at last. Weeks later, headlines would come, indictments, plea deals, sentences that some would call too light and others too harsh. That was always how it went. Justice satisfied no one completely. It wasn't designed to. But Harbor Point changed, not because one man was brave, but because many people decided to stop pretending. The diner stayed open. The Sunday table was just a table again. Kids rode bikes past the courthouse without slowing. Small things, durable things. Then returned to his life with fewer illusions and better boundaries. He stayed in therapy. He kept the rules he'd written for himself. No escalation with civilians present. No violence where evidence would do. No pretending that winning once meant winning forever. On a quiet morning, months later, Ethan pulled into a roadside diner miles from anywhere. He chose a booth with his back to the wall out of habit, not fear. Shadow settled at his feet. The waitress brought coffee and smiled without calculation. Ethan sipped slowly and let the room be just a room. Justice, he understood now, wasn't a moment when the world snapped into alignment. It was a process, uneven, frustrating, incomplete, that only worked when people stayed engaged after the adrenaline faded. He left a generous tip, not as a gesture, but as a practice. Then he stepped back into the day, the road stretching open ahead of him. The work wasn't over. It never was. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cross felt something like balance. Not because the past had been fixed, but because he'd learned how to live forward without turning away. And sometimes that was enough to keep going. If this story made you think differently about power, silence, or courage, share it with someone who needs to hear it.